thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you today. It's really nice to see Pete, actually, especially because Pete sat on the Portable Antiquities Advisory Group for many years, I think, helping advise the Portable Antiquities Scheme and the work we were doing to encourage liaison between archaeologists and metal detector users. As has been described, I am the head of the Portable Antiquities Scheme. I first became involved in the scheme in 2000 as the Finds Liaison Officer for Kent, and then I worked beside Roger Bland, who was head of the scheme for much of the life of the scheme. In fact, it was his idea, the Portable Antiquities Scheme. I had the pleasure of doing that until he retired from the British Museum about 2 years ago. Anyway, I'm going to talk about 20 years of treasure, because this year is the 20th anniversary of the Treasure Act. Now, obviously, treasure is a very emotive word for archaeologists, and we're going to touch on that through this talk. And actually, we're going to talk about some of the things that have just been mentioned as well, about the animosity that there was between archaeologists and detectors, and to be truthful, there is obviously still some underlying tensions from time to time. Now, I'm just going to say, to start with, a few things that we've been doing to highlight this anniversary. Now, one thing's a bit confusing about this anniversary is it's called the Treasure Act 1996. So why are we celebrating it in 2017? Well, the fact is that the Act became law the following year, so in 1997 on the 24th of September. Now, we did several things to celebrate this, which I'll describe now. The first thing is we had a public vote in the Telegraph. So it was a public vote amongst certain readers, I would say. And we had a panel of experts, and they decided amongst themselves, I use expert quite lightly because I was involved with this process, we decided on what we thought were the top 20 archaeological finds that had been found through the Treasure Act, and we invited Telegraph readers to choose the find that they thought it was. And we were perhaps a little bit surprised, in many ways, that the winner was the Frome Hoard. I may come on to talk about this a little bit further later on, but basically it was a vessel of 53,000 Roman coins, the largest Roman coin hoard in a single vessel, so not the largest Roman coin hoard ever found, but certainly in a single vessel. And in this case, I think why that won the vote is because the finder, realising he'd found something significant, stopped, got archaeological help, and the whole hoard was excavated archaeologically, the way we want it to happen. Not that it always happens that way, but it's the way that we want it to happen. And I suppose in some ways it is almost what you don't expect in terms of treasure. It is just a lot of Roman coins that are base metal, and obviously amongst them some very archaeologically interesting ones. But it wasn't the shiny and golden stuff that most people associate with treasure finds. One thing we also did, or have been doing, is we've been encouraging museums that have acquired treasure finds to put them on display so the public can see them. Now, obviously, lots of these finds are always on display anyway, but we were asking museums to make a special effort to celebrate these discoveries. And we reckon about 100 museums across the country, so that's England, Wales and Northern Ireland, where the Act applies, made a special effort to highlight these finds, and it's probably about 600 objects or cases of finds that were displayed. So there's maybe the 52 or 53,000 coins with the Frome Hoard, or it might be a single Anglo-Saxon pommel like you see here. And we had a special logo, the Treasure 20 logo, to display with those objects so people could clearly see that this was something that was being done in partnership with the British Museum. We also encouraged our Finds Liaison Officers, and I'll talk about these again a bit later on, who are based in museums across England and Wales, to do things in relation to treasure. So as you can see, there was talks, there was conferences, there was a lot of kind of stuff on social media, there was treasure trails and all sorts of things like that. And a couple of weeks ago, I even showed Prince Charles some treasure and took him on the part of a treasure trail at Stoke Museum, where they've acquired part of the Staffordshire hoard, and they also have some other smaller treasure finds as well. And of course we've been inviting museums to do displays about treasure finds as well. So there was a new, at the Oxfordshire Museum, they dedicated a whole gallery to portable antiquities and treasure, highlighting recent discoveries that have come through both the portable antiquity scheme and the treasure process. But I'm going to take you back now a little bit and talk about the origins of the Treasure Act, why there was a reform of treasure law in the first place. Now, before I do that, I just want to talk about what the law was before the Treasure Act. For a long time, since medieval times, there was in this country a law of treasure trove, a common law, so not a written law. And it said that objects that are made of gold or silver, buried with the intention of recovery, and the original owners or heirs are unknown, were crown property. And of course, the purpose of this act was so that the monarch could claim any gold and silver that was hanging about, melt it down, and stick it into the royal coffers. Now, over time, thankfully, we realised that not all gold and silver objects of antiquity should be melted down and made into something else, but actually they had a value, an archaeological value even, in their own right. And gradually the law became slightly reformed to enable museums to acquire these objects, so the Crown waived their right to them. But nonetheless, as it was in ancient times, these objects had to be reported to the coroner in the district in which they were found, and that part of the treasure legislation hasn't changed at all. Now, there are some archaeological discoveries that are surely treasures that were not covered by the Treasure Act. So, for example, most of you, I'm sure all of you, will know of the Sutton Hoo treasures that were found in 1939. They were obviously reported as potential treasure under the old law of treasure trove. They went to a coroner's inquest and the coroner declared them not treasure. Why were they not treasure? Well, they were not buried with the intention of recovery in the coroner's review, in the coroner's view, and therefore they were basically handed back to the landowner to do with what she will. She decided, thankfully, to donate them to the British Museum. But the story could have been very different. Now, some of you will know or heard about what I've called here the Battle of Wanborough Temple. Now, in the early 1980s, a couple of detectorists were detecting. They found some Roman coins and they reported them. There was a coroner's inquest, and as a result of that coroner's inquest, lots of other detectorists decided to descend on this site. By this time, the Surrey Archaeological Society had decided that this was an important temple site. These objects seemed to be kind of ritually deposited, maybe as an offering at a spring or something like that. And obviously they were quite keen that an archaeological excavation would happen. And of course it was devastating to them that the site was being ransacked by metal detector users. It was hoped that the treasure legislation would be used as an instrument against those detectorists, but it proved impossible because basically these objects weren't being buried with the intention of recovery. The treasure legislation didn't have any role in this particular instance. Now, as was mentioned a while ago, this incident happened amongst a background of deep animosity between metal detector users and archaeologists. And there was, oh gosh, what's this? Should I say, what do I say to this? No, don't. Remind me in how many hours? 4 hours, should we do that? As you will be aware, there was this campaign called the Stop campaign, Stop Taking Our Past. And from the archives, I've seen this leaflet that was issued by the Council for Kentish Archaeologists. They weren't obviously unique in doing this. There was archaeologists across the country who were highlighting the damage done, as it was seen, to archaeological sites by metal detector users. And when I read this, I find it absolutely fascinating that these were views that were deeply held. And obviously there are people who still hold some of these views. I mean, I like this bit that frequently used metal detectorists, a device never used by genuine archaeologists. So the idea nowadays that we would never use a detector as part of an archaeological survey, obviously in the 1980s, was something that was seen that we wouldn't touch that. And it's funny actually, because I've been out on sites with metal detector users, archaeological surveys I should say, and when those detectors say, "Oh, do you want to go?" There's something in me that says, "Well, actually, I'm not sure I really want to touch this machine because it might somehow contaminate me." And I think there's something in us as archaeologists that's still there that kind of has a bit of a fear of these devices, which, of course, when used in an archaeological way, can be very beneficial. And you can think of things like battlefield archaeology, where it would be almost impossible to do this activity without the use of metal detector users. So it was decided, through different means, to try and establish a new treasure legislation. This initially was known as a treasure bill, and you can see some snippings here from newspapers which show how the Earl of Perth, who sponsored the bill as a private member's bill, initially through the House of Lords, which then gained government support, introduced what we now know as the Treasure Act. Now, I'm sure you all know what treasure is, but I thought it might be just useful just to quickly skim through this, and this will be relevant in the context of some things I'll say a bit later. So, first of all gold and silver objects, or objects that have 10% gold and silver, over 300 years old, are treasure. So that's quite simple to get our heads around. When it comes to coins, it gets a little bit more complex. If they're gold or silver, there has to be 2 or more of them together. If they're base metal, there has to be 10 or more of them. So we're talking about hoards, but these could be dispersed hoards. And sometimes knowing the difference between a dispersed hoards and lots of coins on a site can be a little bit complicated. Also, the Act says that objects found in association with treasure are also treasure. Now, the rationale for this, of course, was that if someone was to find a Roman coin hoard, it would be odd or weird from an archaeological perspective if the coins were treasure, but the pot containing it wasn't treasure. So the idea was that everything found with treasure is treasure. But then, of course, we get these strange finds like this at Wheat Hampstead, where you have glass, copper alloy, ceramics, all found together, which on their own wouldn't be treasure, but because of those 2 small little brooches at the bottom that happened to be silver, the whole lot was treasure. The Act allows the Secretary of State to add new objects to the definition of treasure. And the last time this happened was in 2003. There was a designation order. And it considered the importance of prehistoric base metal assemblages. And I think it was quite an important point because for the first time, it really recognised that it wasn't just shiny things that could be treasure, but other objects could be as well. So through this legislation, groups of, what we used to call founders' hoards could be treasure also. Now, the Act is a little bit strange that it also says that finds that were treasure under the old legislation but are not actually covered by the new legislation could also be treasure. So we have these really, really strange cases that pop up, like this one. This is a jar, a glass jar, of gold American double eagles that was found in a garden in Hackney that went to a coroner's inquest, presuming to be treasure. I'll talk about this case later, but some of you might also remember a hoard of sovereign coins found in a piano, which a coroner declared treasure. Now, obviously, from our perspective as being archaeologists, these are interesting cases, but they're not archaeological cases. But they are cases that are covered by the treasure legislation. Now, of course, the whole purpose of the Treasure Act, and believe me, sometimes when I talk to some metal detectorists, they don't actually get this, is that the purpose of the Act is to ensure that these objects end up in museum collections. That's why the Act exists. In this case, and this is where it gets a little bit controversial for some archaeologists, is that a reward is paid to both the landowner and the finder to the value of the find, and that is normally split 50-50. This value is agreed by an independent committee called the Treasure Valuation Committee, and on it are archaeologists, museum curators, and a representative of the metal detecting fraternity, and also people in the trade who know the value of objects. They make a recommendation that is ultimately agreed by the Secretary of State for Digital Culture, Media and Sport. And it is the case that any objects that aren't acquired are basically returned to the landowner and the finder, and they can do what they will with those objects. So I'm now going to talk a little bit about the success, as I see it, of the Treasure Act. Now, there has been a massive increase in the number of cases reported treasure, as you can see from this graph. So the first full year of the Act was actually 1998, and you will see that when the new legislation came in, we had on average about 200 cases. Now, we're averaging well over 1,000 cases every year. In fact, we think it's now averaging about 100 cases a month. So it's important for me to say here that we're not talking about single finds, we might be talking about groups of objects as well. So the numbers don't reflect the number of objects, but just the number of cases that are dealt with. I should also say that you'll notice there was a slight peak in 2003. Well, there's a trend, an upward trend in 2003. And that was because in 2003, the Portable Antiquity Scheme was expanded to the whole of England and Wales. And one thing that we noticed is that whether or not the legislation says that you have to do something, it is people on the ground reminding people of their legal obligations that actually make sure they follow those legal obligations. So this is a map of England and Wales and Northern Ireland as well, and it shows over the last 20 years, we actually think it's probably about 14,000 treasure cases have been reported. But as you can see, about 40% of those have been acquired by museums. Now, I should say here that some of these objects, whilst of archaeological interest, aren't necessarily collectible for museum people. So we will have lots of post-medieval material, lots of medieval material that is quite fragmentary or very typical, and therefore museums tend to be quite selective in acquiring those objects. But you can see about 215 museums across the country have acquired treasure finds, and you can see from the map as well that some museums are much more avid collectors of treasure finds than others. And maybe we'll return to that again later as well, if we have time. Now, I thought it'd be just useful or nice to kind of highlight a few treasure finds that have come through the Act, just to remind you of some of the things that have come through. Now, this is a personal favourite of mine because it was reported to me when I was Kent Finds Liaison Officer. This is the Ringlemere Cup. So it's, as you can see, it was made roughly 1,700 years before Christ. It has a rounded base, so it couldn't have stood up. It must have been passed around. And what was important about this object is several things, really. Firstly, as you can see, it's got a massive dent on the side, and that is nothing to do with me transporting this object to the British Museum. I can say it always had that dent since it was found. In fact, the archaeologists who did the excavation of the site of the find believes he's identified the actual plough that did that damage. And it is a reminder to us that most of these objects that are found by metal detector users aren't in situ. They've been dislodged from the place where they were. Obviously, another ploughing season, and the Ringlemere Cup could have been not much of a cup at all. What was also interesting about this object when it turned up is that we looked at the historic environment record, we looked at aerial photography, and we noticed things that we never knew before. This landscape on the surface of it seemed quite a barren landscape. But then when we re-examined all of these different source material in relation to this object being found, we realised that this was a rich prehistoric landscape, and that was confirmed through archaeological excavation. Now, of course, many of you, and you probably were surprised that Telegraph readers didn't vote this their number one find, but of course the Staffordshire hoard has probably been one of the most exciting archaeological discoveries found through metal detecting. And as you can see there from that picture, the enormity of the hoard is pretty fantastic. As many of you will know, it's mostly war gear, and it's thought that it was some sort of booty from a battle, perhaps to do with Penda of Mercia. Research on that find is obviously ongoing at the moment, but it is an amazing assemblage of archaeological material. One of my favourite finds, again, is the Vale of York hoard. This was a vessel that within it contained Viking bullion, but the Viking bullion was from all over pretty much the known Viking world. You had Islamic dirhams, and you had a Carolingian vessel in which it was put in, hack silver from more northerly parts of Europe. I mean, again, it's a fascinating object, but what was important about this discovery is that the finders resisted the temptation. They did excavate the vessel, but they did resist the temptation to tip out the contents, and that was instead excavated at the British Museum. And one of the most recent discoveries, and actually this is a remarkable find, but there's a recent sad story to do with this object, which isn't to do with the find itself. The Watlington hoard was found by a metal detectorist called James Mather. He found it on a Wednesday daytime, and he contacted his local finds liaison officer, who happened to be on holiday. I think she was going to Crete. So he contacted his neighbouring finds liaison officer, David Williams, in Surrey. And many of you may have heard the sad news that David Williams passed away at the weekend. David went out there to excavate this hoard, but he couldn't do it immediately. He told the finder, you have to wait until I've gone to a conference at the weekend, and then I'm back afterwards. And the finder obviously think, I can't wait that long. I can't leave it in the ground. And from what I understand, this poor guy paced up and down his house for nights on end, didn't sleep at all, until David was able to arrange this archaeological excavation. And I'll come back to this later. But what was important about this hoard is it contained coins associated with, of Alfred the Great, which seemed to suggest that he had an alliance with a neighbouring king, Ceolwulf, not very well known, who was the last king of Mercia. It seems to suggest that they had an alliance, these two men, that then when Alfred was ensuring history was written in the history books, that this guy was completely erased, and Alfred got the credit for defeating the Danes. And I mentioned before the Hackney hoard, and this, again, although it's not an archaeological find, has a fascinating story. It was buried in a garden in Hackney by some German Jews. They'd obviously escaped Germany. They'd not trusted the banks, so they decided to bury the hoard in their garden, as you do. And unfortunately, during the Blitz, the house was destroyed, and many of the people who were there died as well. There was one person who wasn't killed in this bombing, and the reason he wasn't killed is that he'd been interned by the British government because of his close connections with Germany. He was sent to Australia and Canada, and then eventually ended up in the Isle of Wight before he came back, only to find that his house was destroyed and the gold coins that he'd buried missed. It seems he did get some people to do some digging in the garden in the hope of finding something, but because he was quite a cautious individual, he didn't actually tell them what they were looking for, so they didn't really find anything. Anyway, when this popped up a few years ago, we didn't have any idea of this story at all, but it was only through the interest of a local individual who found that there was a coroner's inquest in the 1960s when a small number of gold coins were found, and he contacted us at the British Museum and said, look, we think this might relate to the old story. And then the coroner had found that the family of this German Jew were the rightful owners of this find. So we were then able to contact his son, who was living in Jerusalem at the time. Now I'm going to briefly talk about the Portable Antiquity Scheme because obviously it relates in a very important way to the Treasure Act. I don't think I really need to remind you too much of this, but it's a surprise when I speak to people in other countries that it is completely legitimate for people to go out there and search for archaeological objects. As we know in this country, it's down to the landowner what happens on their land, and property, including archaeological material, belongs to that landowner. That's very, very different, as you know, with other countries, particularly in Europe, where the state owns this archaeological material. And that really, I think, explains why we have a very different system, wrongly or rightly, in this country to many other countries. So anyone can say, I'm an archaeologist or not. They just need to, I want to do an excavation or I want to dig a hole. As long as they've got the landowner's permission, they can basically do that. Of course, I'll remind you, there are protected sites, not all as fabulous as Stonehenge, where it is illegal to go metal detecting. Now, when the government introduced the new treasure legislation, archaeologists were basically saying, well, that's fine, isn't it? All the gold and silver stuff sorted, but what about everything else, which has, is really, really important for understanding the past? And the government recognised this in this statement, saying, obviously, archaeological objects, if they're not recorded, represent a considerable loss to our nation's heritage. And whilst it was felt that you couldn't have a bureaucratic system like the Treasure Act to capture everything, it could be the case that you could establish voluntary schemes for the recording of archaeological finds, which in essence is what the Portable Antiquity Scheme is. So it's a scheme to record archaeological objects, and the main thrust of the scheme is to advance archaeological knowledge. We aren't there necessarily to make friends with the metal detecting community. We are there to get this information so it can add to archaeological knowledge. Obviously, it's a digital resource rather than an actual real resource. And to date, I looked on the database a couple of days ago, so this figure will be out of date, but we've recorded over 1.3 million archaeological objects from across the country. And as you can see, the map of Britain is like Jeremy Corbyn's vision of Britain of the future. Red dots everywhere. Now, the Portable Antiquities finds recorded obviously has peaks and troughs, but we've basically seen an increase in the number of objects recorded. On average, we record about 80,000 archaeological objects a year, and last year was no difference to that. Now, looking at the objects in a little bit more detail, you can see that about half of them are Roman in date. We are selective in recording post-medieval material, so they're obviously that you would have a lot more post-medieval material if you recorded everything, but for pragmatic reasons, we have to focus on the more ancient material. And it's no surprise that most of these finds are found by metal detector users. We do reach out to anyone and ask them to record what they've been found, but it is, of course, people who go metal detecting that are likely to find this material and record it as well. And an important point, which obviously I highlighted a little bit when we talked about the Ringlemere Cup, is that most of these finds are found in cultivated land. Metal detectorists aren't, in the most, digging into archaeological layers to recover these objects. These objects are being dislodged from an archaeological context by the plough. It is the plough that's damaging these finds, and metal detectorists are finding them. I mean, another important point, which I'm sure is not lost on you, is metal detecting and the way that metal detectorists search is very different to what archaeologists do. There is no archaeologist that I know of that goes out into the middle of the field and thinks, this seems like a good place to stick a trench in. What the hell? Put a trench in and see what you find. But that is exactly what metal detecting does. They go out on a field, sometimes with intelligence about what might be found there, but often just on the hope that they come across something. And of course, that is the way that new sites come to light, by chance. Now, the first aim of the scheme is to advance archaeological knowledge, and I won't bore you too much with this map, but basically it's on the back of a project I'm involved with called the Medieval Markets Project. Just so you know, the blue kind of marks are medieval market sites, and we've been looking at the relationship between these market sites and the metal detector finds from the medieval period. in an attempt to understand a little bit more about medieval trade. There have been lots of people doing research projects based on the Portable Antiquity Scheme. We don't know about all of them. The ones we know about are the people who have come to us to have access to the data, so they get the full data that we have, find spots and everything. And we reckon there's about 600 of these projects to date, of which about 100 or so are PhDs. And of course, this information is important to historic environment records as well. And this is an example of a site in Devon at Ipplepen, where a couple of finders were finding Roman material. The local finds liaison officer thought, this is interesting that they're finding so much. And obviously, when there was an opportunity to do some archaeological survey work, they revealed this sort of kind of site plan of lots of activity going on at the Roman period, which was led to an excavation by Exeter University. The second main aim of the scheme is to share that knowledge. So we do obviously liaise with the public. The real reason we do this, of course, is to encourage people to record archaeological finds, but we do work with children and others who may just by chance come across archaeological objects, or at least for them to know that when they're older that it's important this material is recorded. And as I mentioned before, we have a network of finds liaison officers across the country. So the stars are where the finds liaison officers are based. And most of these are based in museums, sometimes based in local authorities, so like with planning departments, with the historic environment record. Their different bases have different challenges and different opportunities. The third aim of the scheme is to promote best archaeological practice. And in Pete's time, we drew up a code of practice for responsible metal detecting, and you can see all the organisations that have endorsed that. Recently, we've revised the code, we've just updated it really, it's not fundamentally different. But the idea of the code is to instruct metal detectors what we as archaeologists believe they should do before, whilst and after metal detecting to ensure there's a greater preservation of the archaeological record as possible. And the code of practice has actually been used by other organisations in terms of the agreement that they give to people who go metal detecting. So, for example, in London, the Port of London Authority says that anyone who detects on the foreshore has to report their finds to the Portable Antiquity Scheme. Likewise, if anybody goes on Crown Estate land, they also have to, as a requirement, that they have to report their finds and follow the code of practice for responsible metal detecting. So it's being used more, although it's a voluntary guidance, it's being used more in a mandatory way than was perhaps envisaged initially. An important point to make here, and of course Pete was very much involved with the Nighthawking study that Historic England did on the extent of illegal metal detecting, but also other sorts of heritage crime. The finds liaison officers are on the ground, they hear about these instances. Metal detectors also hear about them as well, and they report them to us. I have to say that metal detecting, although there are obviously individuals out there who are conducting illegal activity, is not as big as some other forms of heritage crime. So a couple of years ago, particularly, there was a massive spate of people obviously stealing lead and other and copper, for example, from historic buildings. And of course, vandalism is one of those threats to the historic environment that's been with us for a very long time. So I don't want to over-exaggerate the extent to which metal detecting is one of these heritage crimes, but it is obviously on the radar of the police, and we do work quite closely with the police in terms of bringing individuals who commit illegal activity to court. Now, the Portable Antiquity Scheme has also become a vision for other countries, and I'm going to just highlight the Netherlands here, although I could say a similar thing about Flanders, which is a bit odd in terms of Belgium, and Denmark as well, and more recently Finland. But the Netherlands, they decided to set up a recording scheme for archaeological objects found by the public, following a change in the legislation in the Netherlands, which made it made metal detecting legal under licence. So there's been a long tradition of people metal detecting in the Netherlands. Archaeologists have known about it and not really done much about it, and the police were really disinterested in it. They saw it as not a particularly a big problem. So metal detecting was illegal, but basically happened. And the law sort of normalised what the relationship was, but said that people who go metal detecting can only dig within the plough soil, and they have to have a licence to do that. And they came up with a very imaginative name for the recording scheme in the Netherlands. They called it the Portable Antiquity Scheme of the Netherlands. So there's no shyness in where the idea came from. On the back of that, we've been working with colleagues in the countries I've mentioned to develop what we call a North Sea finds recording group. Because from an archaeological perspective, these boundaries that we have nowadays of countries don't make much sense necessarily from an archaeological perspective. So the idea of actually comparing data from different countries of Europe is quite an exciting one. Although, of course, in England we have 1.3 million objects. In the Netherlands, they will talk about several thousand. So we're at different points. But in the future, the opportunity to study this archaeology from, across Europe could be quite exciting. So whilst the rest of the country is kind of moving away from Europe, we're doing our best to move closer to Europe in some respects. And like I mentioned before, one of the important aims of the scheme is to encourage museum acquisition of archaeological objects. And the main way that happens is through the treasure legislation. But I'm going to come back to this in a little bit. I should say, of course, that people who find archaeological finds, these are a couple of detectorists who have been detecting at Rendlesham in Suffolk. They do get excited to see their finds on display. And I think it's fair to say that a lot of detectorists do have a very genuine passion in the past. They've just come into archaeology in a different way to some of us. Now, I wanted to end, although it's not quite a sudden end, by looking at a few problems and opportunities that remain, because I don't want to talk to you and say, well, it's all absolutely fine now, nothing to worry about, there's no challenges for the future, we all get on well, and that's it, done and dusted. There are problems, and I think there are some of those that are going to be really difficult to change, and some of them I think are easier. But given that we're in this environment now where there's much more dialogue between archaeologists and detectorists, I think we're in more of a position to have a grown-up conversation about some of these things, because the world of archaeology and the world of metal detecting has changed in the last 20 years. Now, the first thing is an easy question, you would think, but how do we encourage best practice? Now, we as archaeologists, working with the metal detecting community and landowners as well, have developed, as I said, a code of practice for responsible metal detecting. Well, it's easy, isn't it, for us to wave about a document and say, oh, here's a document you've got to follow. How do we get people on the ground to follow it? How do we actually get them to do that? And also, more importantly probably, how do we recognise better those that do it? What are the rewards for those that behave in the most archaeological way, not in a financial way, but what are the rewards in terms of being embraced by the archaeological community, as opposed to those who give lip service to recording but don't actually do it? So that's not really an answer, that's more of a question. My kind of view is that we need to develop opportunities for metal detector users who embrace archaeology to be more involved with what we do as archaeologists. That may be local archaeological projects, that might be to do with research that we're doing. And already we have a Heritage Lottery funded project called Past Explorers, which is now in its third year, where we're giving training to metal detector users so that they can record their own finds on the Portable Antiquity Scheme database after thorough training and under supervision. Now, a second and big challenge is how do we enable emergency excavations? Now, I mentioned the Watlington hoard, and we were very fortunate in that instance that David Williams was able to come out and do it. But what about if he wasn't? What would have happened then? Now, in the Code of Practice for Responsible Metal Detecting, we say that if you find something that's significant or important that's in situ, you should stop and you should call for an archaeological help. How does that happen in practice? They will probably ring up their fines liaison officer. Invariably, they will be metal detecting at the weekend, maybe on Christmas Day or Boxing Day or whatever. Are we expecting the fines liaison officer to drop that, everything they do, and respond to that excavation? Sometimes, of course, the local fines liaison officer will be very, very competent to undertake an archaeological excavation. In other instances, they'll feel less confident to do that, and they'll have to draw upon the expertise of others. So it'll be asking favours of other people. The point I'm trying to make is that we do not have a mechanism to respond to these archaeological excavations. There isn't a fund that you can just call on and say, we want to have some archaeologists come out here and do this excavation and pay for it. How does that happen? And of course, given the potential that these finds might not end up in museum collections, we hope they will, but because they won't, will people be prepared to give time and resources to help that in those situations? It's an important point. But what I'm saying is, in the past, people used to say, metal detector users, that's a portable antiquities problem. But I think if we want people to do things in a responsible way, there has to be a more holistic approach to dealing with this. Now, a big problem, which has remained with us for a long time, is how do we deal with metal detecting rallies? Now, metal detecting rallies are an odd event, really, in many ways. Sometimes people will organise a club visit. So it will be a metal detecting club. They will go to a trusted farmer and they will detect together. And they may call that a rally, but actually that's a club outing. And in those circumstances, most people would be quite keen to record their finds. What I'm talking about here is commercial events, where an individual thinks it's a good idea to pay a landowner quite a bit of money for the opportunity to let lots of people, and it could be several hundred, maybe even 1,000 people, onto a part of a bit of land, and basically detect. Now, I can understand the appeal of this to many metal detector users who may find it difficult to gain access to land, and they won't have to deal with the permissions and all of that sort of stuff. It's kind of sorted out for them, as it were. But the potential damage that this could do, especially if these people aren't recording their objects, is really, really tricky. We've taken a recent decision that we will not try and record archaeological finds in the field at metal detecting rallies. We're going to have to see how that goes, and we may have to reflect upon this. But traditionally, the fines liaison officer has tried to go to as many rallies as possible and record those finds. But it is a big problem because it's very, very resource intensive, especially if you've got lots of people, and it gives a very artificial impression of what recording finds is about. Traditionally, we like to take finds in, we like to bring them into our offices, we like to research them with the textbooks and the database and things at hand, we like to photograph them in ideal circumstances, we like to record them in ideal circumstances as well. The idea that you can do it on a trestle table in the middle of a field with it pelting with rain and you can make a good record is not the same. But you see people handing over objects will think, well, I've recorded it. I've done my duty. Whether the record's any good is another question. So it kind of goes back to how do we get individuals to sign up to the code in their own minds. When they go to a metal detecting rally, they need to think, look, how am I impacting on the archaeological record? Am I enabling these finds to be recorded in the way that they should be recorded? And if not, should I be doing this or should I be doing something else? I like the idea that we try to encourage the individual to take much more responsibility for what is happening and not just rely on archaeologists to kind of mop up, really. Now, a couple of more things, and this is a big question for archaeologists. Should all finds end up in public collections? Now, we as archaeologists are taught at school, at university, that all of this stuff from the past is really important. It should be in a museum collection so that everyone can be able to access it and they can research it and enjoy. Now, if you talk to museum curators and museum archaeologists, they might say, well, actually, we'd like to be a bit more selective than that. And obviously we do have a big problem in this country in terms of archaeological archives. You know, we have collected too much stuff. Now, how do we deaccession that? And then what happens to those objects? I remember when I was Kent Finds Liaison Officer and I was having a dialogue with a colleague of mine who was an important archaeologist. And I said, look, what should we do to this stuff? I mean, imagine the finder says, look, okay, I don't want it. And you go to the museum and they say, I don't want it either. What do you do with it? You've got all of this stuff that's been found. And he said, well, we should just stick it back in the ground then, shouldn't we? Is that the answer? I don't know. I'm not saying I have an answer, but I think we have to sometimes be a bit pragmatic about what we really want from these finds. Now, we know with animal bones, pottery, other things, we are much more selective in what we record. And looking at this tray on eBay, you know, should they sell it or not? It's another question. But the point is, amongst that is lots of stuff that we would never want in a museum collection. There's lots of stuff that we probably wouldn't even record from a portable antiquities perspective. So is it right then to say to those finders, well, we're not interested in it from an archaeological perspective, but you shouldn't get rid of it or sell it even? Related to that, and it's a kind of a philosophical question really, is how do we encourage finders to donate finds to local museums? And I think I've got an idea that might work, and it'd be interesting to have your views on this, but it takes an element of us of trust with this. So most metal detector users, you know, people go out metal detecting because they want to find things. When they find the objects, some people become slightly disinterested in them. Some people don't care where they go. Other people want a collection of these objects. They like to keep them. Others want the money that these objects represent, and so they will sell them off. But often people won't be offering these objects to museums first, and then museums may not acquire them. So is it possible that we just think of the detectorist as someone who is a custodian of those objects? We all know that we're going to die, don't we? And as a collector of archaeological material, they know that they're not going to be able to take it with them. They're not like the Sutton Radwald who can take his stuff and hope that it will still be there. I don't think that happens. I've never known a detectorist to be buried with their material, but maybe they will. But the question I'm kind of posing here is, instead of kind of saying to people, look, this should be in a museum, is it better to say, look, we think you should take care of the collection, you should properly curate it, you should keep the find spots with these objects. So when you die and you don't have any need for it, it is useful to someone else. It's not the case that your wife is just going to check it out and say, what's this rubbish, and throw it away. Or it's offered to a museum, and the museum says, well, I've got no idea where this stuff is from. It's got no archaeological value whatsoever. So I think we need to do more work on trying to encourage people to take a custodial view to these objects that they collate. And this is a kind of an inward thinking question really, is how do we sustain our digital infrastructure? So for example, the Portable Antiquities Scheme database. The Portable Antiquities Scheme database was developed when the scheme went national in 2003, and it's gone through various iterations. And I think it's probably fair to say that these have been bolt-on, bits of bolt-on work. So we had the core database that was developed by Oxford Digital, and then on top of that, in-house, the database was improved with new things that have come along. But it's a bit like a car where we've changed the wheels, changed the steering wheel, changed the seats and things. I mean, it kind of works quite well in terms of the public, but it could do with new technology. Now, of course, we're lucky and fortunate that other countries like Flanders, Denmark, and the Netherlands have developed new databases with new technology. Can we just appropriate their systems for recording finds? So the question is, do we have portals to allow us to interrogate each other's data, or do we combine resources somehow and learn from each other? And of course, I kind of feel that we should do both of those things. And the last thing I was just going to mention before I finish and open to questions is how do we develop our partnerships within Portable Antiquities, specifically in terms of the long-term sustainability of the Portable Antiquities Scheme. Now, the way the Portable Antiquity Scheme is funded at the moment is like this. There's a grant in aid that's made to the British Museum of several millions of pounds, and of that, a proportion, 953,000, is given as grants to local partners to employ the local finds liaison officers and other staff. Now, that sounds like a lot of money on the surface, but when you think of 50 people involved with a Portable Antiquity Scheme, it's not a lot, and some finds liaison officers, as you appreciate, are not paid particularly well. Now, what's happened over time is that because the funding for the Portable Antiquity Scheme and the funding for the British Museum is flatlined, then the pickup for the increased costs is rests with the local partner. And of course, in all of those cases, the local partner is a local authority, museum or a trust, something like that. And of course, for them, that represents a cut. Now, in most cases, a finds liaison officer is 80 to 90% funded, and it does vary, by the British Museum. So the local contribution is only a few £1,000s. But nonetheless, in the times that we're in, that is tricky. So what I've recently done is I've commissioned an external review of the partnership model of the scheme to see how can we overcome this. Now, the money is one aspect, but in the other way, it's about taking the opportunity to look back and think, well, why is everyone who's a partner within the Portable Antiquity Scheme doing it? Why are they involved? Because sometimes it's easy to forget that, to forget what all of the benefits of this scheme have been and what would it be without it. So we're asking people to think about those benefits of the scheme so that they can think, yes, it's something that we're passionate about, and that's what I get from most of the local partners, that they're really keen to have a finds liaison officer. They love the kind of link with the British Museum. They love the work the finds liaison officer is doing. They think it's important in terms of adding to local archaeological knowledge, but the money is the issue. And how do we use opportunities with the British Museum and the local partners working better together to get that? The idea I like is to have local champions for Portable Antiquity Scheme. So people who may be a little bit distant from the British Museum, a little bit distant from the local organisations, but would be those that would look for opportunities that can help support the scheme in a financial way, but also opportunities to develop partnerships. But that's a work in progress. So the last thing I was going to say, because I've got 2 minutes to say this probably, is that the government, and the government's been saying this for a while now. I think we've just published another Treasure Act annual report, and once again in it, for the 4th time running, I think the Minister says imminently we're going to undertake a review of the Treasure Act, and the government is still keen to undertake a review of the Treasure Act, and we've heard that the Arts Minister is quite keen for people to nobble the DCMS, because that gives them leverage with number 10, as it were, to get on with it. I mean, we know the civil servants have done a lot of work on this, and there's 3 main aspects which I'll very quickly explain. The first one is that should the definition of treasure be increased? And I think most archaeologists would say yes, it would be nice to capture other sorts of archaeological material, particularly material that is of archaeological value but not necessarily glitzy or gold. So how do you capture that material? And that is a challenge, actually. The second aspect is that there were things that were passed through the Coroners and Justice Act, which is really odd because it's an act that was passed through Parliament that was never, only parts of it were implemented, but there's parts within that legislation that deal with the enforcement of heritage crime, which we would like to see as part of the treasure legislation. One important thing is that at the moment, under the treasure legislation, it says only the finder has an obligation to report treasure. So it could be the case that when it goes to a dealer, for example, they might feel, well, actually, I don't have a legal obligation under the Treasure Act. It would be a powerful tool if it said that dealers also had, or anybody who's a third party, had an obligation to report treasure also. And the last thing is to normalise what happens under the treasure process anyway. So, for example, the Act says that people should report the find to the coroner in the district in which it was found. But in practice, people obviously report them to their local finds liaison officer. And there have been instances where finders have basically said, well, I don't want to hand it to the finds liaison officer because the law says I have to hand it to the coroner. And then the coroner says, well, I instruct them to hand it to the finds liaison officer, and they argue the case a bit. And even within the legislation, it doesn't actually clearly say that they have to hand over the object. It's just the reporting of the find is enough. So there's things to clear up, basically, that a review of the Act would solve. But that's me done, and if anybody has any questions, I'm obviously happy to answer them.